Good afternoon, everybody. Hi. My name is Jennifer DeClue, and I'm a professor in the program for the study of women and gender, and I'm glad that you're here. I'm just going to say a few things to introduce our speakers. I just want to begin by saying I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you for coming on a Friday afternoon. So this event is the beginning of a set of events and conversations that I'm sure will sustain and fortify us for days and weeks and who knows how long. The work of the two incredible people who are joining us this weekend has changed the landscape of trans activism and not only brought awareness about trans life to people outside of the LGBT community, but has made the LGBT community aware of the hierarchies and dismissals that we perpetuate within our own communities. Miss Major Griffin Gracie is in the house, and so is Dean Spade. And the work that each of you has done has changed the lives of so many people, those who get to share community with you in everyday life, and those of us who are inspired by all that you do from afar. We read your work, we study your words, and we learn through the experiences that you so vulnerably share with us. And in our studying, we see that through resistance, you build queer family. You reach the people who are forgotten or abandoned, and you care and love them through it. You organize and teach others how to organize so that we can find a way to live in a world that, as Audre Lorde reminds us in A Litany for Survival, we were never meant to survive. You make a way for survival and a way for love to travel. In the classes that I teach here in the program for the study of women and gender, we call upon your work because it helps us develop a language to understand the world around us, the systems that we find ourselves in and try to navigate. You teach us about power and resistance, and you help us to not feel ashamed of who we are. And you show us how to recognize the power that we have and give us some ideas about the ways that we can harness it together as a community. You share with us the gift of resistance, and we are so honored that you are here with us this weekend. I would like to add that the events this weekend were made possible by the support of the Kitsy Denison Fieldman Fund. This is a fund that supports a lot of the programming that we do in SWG, and so we could not put on this event without that support. And before I introduce our speaker tonight, I want to remind you about what's happening tomorrow. So at 1 o'clock in this same room, we're going to be screening the documentary film Major. We screened it last year, or 2 years ago in Outfest on the Road, but this time we get to screen it and we get to have Miss Major with us to talk about the film afterward. And then Miss Major is going to give a talk called Know Your History. And then the three of us, Dean, Miss Major, and I, we're going to have a conversation. So please join us for those events tomorrow. I'm really excited about that. And I'm really excited to introduce the speaker for this evening. So Dean is going to give a talk called Getting Together, Tearing It Apart. And we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, so stick around. So if you're not familiar with Dean Spade's work, I'll just tell you a little bit. He's a writer, a teacher, and a lawyer. His book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law, was published in 2011. I teach that book. I know a lot of people on our campus teach the book and at the 5 colleges. So we've studied your work, and we know it well, and we're so thankful that you've helped us think about the structures that try to bind us and give us language to talk about that. Dean Spade founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project in 2002, and that is a nonprofit law collective that provides free legal services to transgender, intersex, gender nonconforming people, low-income people, and people of color. He's currently an assistant professor at Seattle University Law School, where he teaches administrative law, poverty law, and law and social movements. So please join me in welcoming Dean Spade to the stage.
I'm really grateful for that incredible introduction and all of the organizing work that you put in to making these events happen. I'm so excited to be here with Major, and it's just a really unique and special weekend of events, and I know how much it takes to make that happen. So I'm very grateful to you and grateful to Lena and SWG and all the people who helped make it happen. Really glad to be back at Smith. Yes, I changed the title of my talk to, this is the name of a book I'm writing that I've been working on for a couple years, and I have never presented it to anybody or let any of my friends read it until yesterday I presented it in Boston. And then today I'm sharing it with you all. So, surprise, new ideas, it's terrifying. You know, this work is a critique of self-help, and it's also an attempt to take insights from self-help literatures and tools and programs and actually make them useful to activists. You know, I'm witnessing what maybe others are also witnessing, which is that it often feels like there's a lot of big fights that we're all involved in, but a lot of what we struggle with is actually like conflict and drama and harm inside our movements and between people in subcultures that are resistant. And so that has really driven me to do this piece of work. Most of my work before this, you know, has been about both, like, on the one hand, like, what should our movements be aiming for? Like, what are our big visions? You know, thinking a lot about things like prison and border abolition, thinking about how to imagine a queer and trans anti-colonial politics or anti-capitalist politics, and also thinking about what kinds of infrastructure we need in our movements, like how our organizations should look to live those politics and to make that operate between us. And so this, you know, sort of next piece of the work that grows out of that is the part that, of course, we're all always doing, which is the part that I spent less time writing about, which is, you know, comes from my work with myself and supporting other organizations and individuals on, like, what's happening at the interpersonal level between us, and how we can be together in new movements in ways that actually create new social relations, which is what I think we're striving for, and kind of asking ourselves, what does that require? What gets in the way? What kinds of structures have we internalized? Right, like if I'm living in a prison society, how is that operating also in how I feel about myself and others, and what kinds of things I do in our interactions as collaborators in movement, and in our other intimate relationships. You know, an example that always comes up that I think is really clear is, like, people in our society have a really hard time giving and receiving feedback. It's really, really, really hard for us when somebody wants to say, to let us know that something's not working for them that we're doing. It's very hard to be open to that, and we have a very hard time being frank with people, and it causes like a zillion problems. And I think that has something to do with living in a society that has a strong idea about good guys and bad guys, and that exiles people who we believe are bad. And so, that, you know, this is the kind of level of the work that I'm trying to get to with this. So tonight what I want to do is just share like 3 small parts of this project as a way of kind of suggesting a little bit about what it's about. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about why this self-help genre is so hard for radicals and doesn't tend to work for us very well. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think learning to feel more is essential to our transformative projects. And I'm going to, if I have time, talk a little bit about how the romance myth harms our movements. So I would like to start with this quote from Adrienne Maree Brown's amazing book, Emergent Strategy. Adrienne Maree Brown asks, or says, what we're all really asking is, how do we, who know the world needs to change, begin to practice being different? How do we have to be for justice to truly be transformative? Not them, that mass amorphous them that is also us, in our heads and our hearts, or that loves us, or that is tired of this shit but is family to us. Not them, because maybe they don't recognize yet that these changes are the key to human survival, but us who are awake and awakening. How do we need to be for Black lives to matter? Such a like beautiful way of putting this set of questions that I'm thinking about. Really appreciate her work. Okay. So what I want to start thinking about first is just like some of the limits of the self-help genre, just like being really real about it, right? One of the things that's so hard about self-help work in general, you know, which is a booming area of publishing and online programs and et cetera, is that it tends to really individualize problems and decontextualize them, right? So it makes us all blameworthy for the distortions we're carrying around that come from living in a society in which we feel a lot of precarity, and that the things we do to survive the conditions under which we live are kind of like pathologized by self-help literatures and taken out of the context in which they actually happen. It makes us responsible for our experiences on an individual level instead of really looking at how they're produced by these conditions. And it kind of is based on an idea that we should all become like fit to rise to the top and be happy, right? In this kind of very like blank way. Tends to ignore the material conditions that actually prop up certain populations by exploiting, stealing from, and murdering other populations. And the worst versions of this appear in self-help genres that suggest that anyone who like performs their programs will become wealthy, right? So like people who are poor must not be thinking positively enough, like these kinds of logics, right? It's very painful and offensive. kind of the idea, if you can dream it, you can do it, right? Like that really ignore like the brutal material realities. Self-help genres also tend to imagine a very narrow idea of the good life that is hard for people with critical ideas or radical politics to want to get near. I think that one of the obvious examples of this is that the entire romance self-help genre is pretty much like dedicated to the fact that everybody should be in a monogamous marriage, right? And like our communities have much more complex and varying ideas of what a good life might look like, and we're interested in disrupting and destroying the idea of the good life that we've been fed. So it's very hard to like turn with our personal pain to a genre that reiterates those very things to us. A lot of self-help books and programs tend to hate and judge the very people who our movements most need to embrace and support, like current drug users, people who've harmed others, poor people, single people, promiscuous people, people who are currently in a mental health crisis, people who get in fights, people who don't exercise, who don't go to therapy, who don't speak in I statements, or follow other rules and guidelines that have been used by gatekeepers and social services, bosses, cops, and various institutions to decide, whose lives are supported and whose will be abandoned. Self-help also generally can really contribute to this blaming and judging piece, hiding systemic violence and maldistribution and blaming people who are failing in the system as if they're individually doing something wrong. And this kind of ties into the broader social exclusion of smokers, of fat people, people who don't want to take medicines that professionals want them to take, like all those mechanisms that we see happening in our society. We can see it in policies that make employees or students at universities sign wellness contracts or give financial incentives at work for not smoking or for not being fat or for doing yoga or meditation, like this whole logic. We can see it in psychiatric imprisonment and forced drugging of children and people in criminal punishment facilities. I just was seeing a friend post who's works at York University, and the people are on strike at York University, and the person posted this letter that was sent to them as an employee of York University by like the HR people or whatever, and it was like, there's a labor disruption going on. It may be causing stress and fatigue for you. Don't forget to get up and walk around from your desk. Don't forget to find balance in your life. Find time to do something you enjoy every day. And if you have health and safety concerns, speak to your manager. It's like there's a labor dispute. Like maybe this person doesn't have time to do something they enjoy every day because of the conditions of their labor. So it's really like it just displaces this back onto us, right? This obligation. And for that reason, self-help regimes tend to be coerced and coercive, right? So our physical and emotional health is under attack from toxic pollution and profit-driven industrialized food systems and fossil fuel dependence and exploitative labor conditions. And yet the narrative is that you need to be responsible for your own health, and it's a matter of like your personal choices and your personal responsibility. We're supposed to download apps to monitor our sleep and count our steps, and we're mandated to go to parenting classes by family courts, or we're required to perform sobriety narratives to get parole or probation. It's like this whole, there's obviously many people in this room who I'm sure are historians of these narratives of rehabilitation. But a lot of this really is tied into something that those of us who care about social control are worried about, which is like how forced health interventions are part of getting basic needs met in this kind of under these kinds of conditions, right? Like you can't get housing unless you can prove that you have no drugs in your urine or are taking this pill. Like all that entire framework is something that we want to obviously be resisting and dismantling. For these reasons, also obviously self-help is ableist. These regimes tend to invest in an idea of a healthy mind and a healthy body that's norm enforcing, and this is even true of ones that understand themselves to be anti-capitalist or anti-racist or feminist. There's a tendency to find like there's like a proper way to behave and a proper way of being. And a lot of them are also invested very thoroughly in the idea of cure. And I don't know if this has been going around this campus, but I really recommend Eli Clare's recent book, Brilliant Imperfection, that really helps us think about the way that the idea of a cure is about trying to get sick and disabled people to like disappear and not exist, right? Self-help is also, an industry, right? And it's an industry about like selling you something that you can do in 30 days and feel like completely different, right? And it's very profit driven. And it promises wealth and happiness and joyful employment, weight loss, smooth skin, romantic partnership, and all these other kind of capitalist fantasies and white supremacist fantasies that, just to sell stuff, right? And that's concerning. And one of the things I think is one of the biggest obstacles to radical and progressive people wanting to read this genre is that it's like almost all written by white upper class people, and all the people they're talking about, like, because usually it's written by therapists, and like the people who are their clients in the books are white upper class people, and if they do have like a person of color, a queer person, it's like really exoticizing, and so you really know that's not who's supposed to be reading this book. It's just like ick. Like, of course, I can't recommend. I love reading these books, and I cannot recommend them to anybody. for these reasons. And finally, for me, this is important also, the self-help genre really fetishizes science, especially now. I mean, probably it always has, but there's this like, it's all about scientific claims about like our brains and our DNA, which are just, it's like an uncritical embrace of racist, sexist, ableist, settler science in every way. It's just like, well, this is what men are like, and this is what women are like, and this is what is a natural relationship, and a natural body, and natural feelings, and natural sexuality, and all these things that, of course, are just like abhorrent to like to feminists and people who are trying to dismantle those systems. So there's a lot that is hard about the self-help genre. So what I'm trying to do is find a way to engage in self-inquiry and development on a personal level that's committed to our movement values of dismantling hierarchies of deservingness. Like, that's my real hope. I think we can examine our lives and the areas in them that cause us like the most drama and distress, and we can use our political principles to guide us. And I just see a lot of pain and conflict in activist contexts, and so I think this is work we actually really have to do. We need to deal with some of our shit and figure out how to show up for each other differently than we are. I mean, we could just talk about just how the ways we are not doing that makes us open to law enforcement infiltration in our movements. Like, that alone could be is its own interesting conversation. I also see how like distorted perceptions of self and context can prevent people from participating in political work that would bring connection and creativity to them potentially. A lot of people are feeling really pissed and scared these days, I think, but and very unsatisfied. But there's so many patterns and reactions that prevent them from actually joining others in resistance. And so I also want us to have ways to look at like how to overcome some of the isolation that I think is pretty typical right now. I've needed and sought a lot of tools in my life to deal with what I've been through, and I've had to do a lot of like reading between the lines to use these literatures, and I think it's like barely tolerable to me and reasonably not tolerable for a lot of people. So part of what I'm doing is just like trying to, in this book, is just like translate some of the things I thought were useful, but put them in a political way that people might like. I did that twist in my head, and so I'm just like, here, in case you don't want to have to read the terrible racist, sexist book about this, here's my cliff notes, basically, on some of those ideas. And then some of it is just ideas that come from my own traveling in activist communities and trying to support myself and other people through conflict and difficult things. It's hard to come out to you all about this work for a lot of reasons, right? Like, we live in a society in which we're supposed to all be independent and high functioning and unemotional and invulnerable, and those are kind of the patriarchal, white supremacist, colonial norms. And so it's hard. There's a lot of ways in which even the topics that are in these books are sort of taboo. I think there's also some additional like lefty taboo around things that are touchy-feely. I think this is changing pretty significantly right now in weird ways that are about like selling crystals at Urban Outfitters, like not necessarily in ways that I would say are like truly healing us, but whatever, I'll take it. There's some mix-up happening around how judgy we are about that right now, but I do think it makes it hard to really talk about some of how we actually treat each other in movement, and then get tools to change it instead of just being on autopilot of like social scripts that we actually oppose if we were to think about it through our political principles. So one place we see this happening, this is where it takes a while for some reason this slide, I have to press a lot, One place we see this happening is there are a lot of different kinds of debates about self-care in our movements. And people kind of identify a tension potentially between collective action and individual healing and wellness that I think we can ask whether or not that's really a tension, and we can talk about what we think about that. But one way I've been thinking about this is through this image of a pendulum. I was inspired to use an image of a pendulum because of a workshop I went to in 2010 where people from the staff of the Communities United Against Violence, the San Francisco queer anti-violence organization, used a pendulum to talk about like accountability. On the one side, they put like when we minimize harm, and on the other side, they put where we like exile people and imprison them. And they said like neither of those things is accountability, right? Those are like the existing options in our culture. Either like this harm didn't happen at all, or somebody's a monster. And they were trying to find accountability in the middle. And I just liked that pendulum thing, but I'm not sure it works, and I accept feedback on that. Anyway, Google Drive. There it is. Okay. So this pendulum, what I'm trying to help us think about is these two sides of the conversation I was just talking about self-care. So on the one side, on the side that's far away from me, we have the idea that healing ourselves is the way to liberation. This idea includes, a strong emphasis on individual healing. Healing ourselves is the only thing we need to do to change the world, in the extreme version, right? It's the primary focus of our resources. It's about focusing our attention on our own needs and processes. I read a really lovely zine that's free online that I recommend called Self as Other, that's from Crime Think. And they talk about how one of the dangers of this also is that like it can be all about focusing on calming ourselves down. A lot of the self-help genre is just about calming down. But of course, as radicals, we are interested in the importance and wisdom and beauty of not being calm and being pissed and being militant. And so that can be like one danger of it. And another danger of it is that it can kind of reproduce an idea that when we do that like we're bad when we do self-destructive things. And there's so many people in our communities who survive by doing things that society labels self-destructive that I really feel concerned about the way that happens. And the zine does a really great job of talking about like moving away from a binary between health and productivity versus like self-destructiveness and sickness, and all the ways that can be marginalizing and ableist and so many things. So when we're on that side, there's kind of like an idea that we're just accountable to that project of our own healing, and not really to other people or to organizations or to the movement or to a strategy for collective action. And that people on that side might think that people who are doing that stuff are just like too externally focused or like too materialistic, right? There's kind of a judgment happening there. And also, when we're on that side, we might be really judgmental of people who aren't doing the self-help work we're doing. We're like, oh, they're irresponsible with their lives. There's kind of a work ethic in there, like you need to be working on yourself to heal. That's very, has a lot of internalized capitalism in it, and a moral imperative to heal that says that people who don't do it are bad. One of my biggest fears with this piece of work that I'm working on is that it would be used to judge people in this way. In my opinion, the reason to do this kind of work on our own interpersonal shit that makes it, that comes up in our relationships and our collaborations is so that we can be more prepared to have capacity to be with people who are going through a hard time or having big feelings, not so that we can judge them and exclude them, right? So I'm doing this so that I'm better at being with them, not so that I can get away from them. You know what I mean? And I hope other people do it so that when I'm the person having the big feelings or acting something out or being intense or harmful, that others will have the capacity to be with me, right? Like that's why I want us to do this work. So it's not towards judgment, which is I think is actually pretty hard to imagine in our culture. So I'm terrified that I'll write this book, people use it to judge each other. That's what we radicals do, so probably we will. Okay, and just to increase our capacities to stay on our purpose, even when hard things are happening. What's also hard about that side is that it really mirrors a lot about consumer culture, which is like, this idea that everything's about choices made by individuals. If we wear the right clothes and listen to the right music and post the right opinions on social media and exercise and eat the right foods, we can be free, happy, healthy, and connected to others, which of course is a lie because we can never get freedom through consumerism, right? Like, and the idea of happiness that it sells is a very thin one, and it often sells us that by selling us like very thin versions of like feminism or anti-racism. It's really challenging, and I think at its worst, that side of the pendulum kind of is like, well, if everybody would just feel love, if everybody would meditate, and if everybody would realize we were all humans, that it would change the world, and we should practice peace and like coexist, that kind of shit. Like the worst versions of that are like, if we could just get like Israeli children and Palestinian children together, and then they could just play, then the war would end. Like this, just like flattening, just ignoring of like true power dynamics, social conditions of colonialism, of racism. So that's like what's hard on that side. And on this side, there's a set of other things that are hard, which is like when we don't value caring for ourselves or our bodies or our relationships, and we're just like, my only value is like, how many meetings did I show up to, and did I, how am I part of the struggle? And when we're on this side, we might call people who do things to take care of themselves selfish or bourgeois or capitalist, or we might judge people who miss a meeting to get rest or take time off or say no to new commitments. And we valorize overwork and we brag about how tired we are. And we set up organizations and agendas that are inhumane for people to be part of in their pacing. And we tend to silence people's concerns about dominance, hierarchy, harm, and violence in our movements. Right? So there's a long history of that, of being like, oh, you're dividing us by bringing up racism again, by bringing up sexism again. Like, that's the same kind of thinking. And what that leads to usually is people just being focused on taking over power positions, and then the victories that they win set up systems that are like a lot just like the same thing the system was before. Right? So there's like major dangers on both sides of this. And what I'm kind of interested in, if we acknowledge that social movements are made up of relationships, and that people come to social movements because we're seeking belonging and relief from isolation and alienation, maybe they also offer us a place to practice being a different way with each other, and to look at the kind of many external and internal structures that we're fighting. Social movements are talking about this in a bunch of ways. These are some of the terms people are using to talk about this: mutual care and mutual aid, collective healing and liberation, politicized healing, reciprocal care, healing justice, community care. These are all terms that if you look them up online, you'll find people writing like really brilliant things about how to do this reimagining beyond those kind of polar positions that I was just talking about. Obviously, there's a lot of like women of color, feminist leadership in these conversations for a very long time, and right now. Another part of this for me is thinking about, as I mentioned, like why we would want to learn to feel more and how hard it is to want to feel more potentially in the current cultural conditions. The systems that we live under really want us to be numb. The conditions that we're experiencing make it hard for us to feel a full range of feelings and to know what we're even feeling and to take our feelings and other people's feelings seriously. It happens in a lot of ways. It's really painful to live in a society where a lot of people are suffering when you're walking down the street and you see like cops harassing and kidnapping people, and you see people living outside, and people you know are exhausted or exploited and are living with the trauma of horrible things happening to them. And there's a lot of desensitization that people go through just to like get by in that. And it's also hard to just see injustice. Like I think inside every one of us is like that little kid who's like, that's not fair. And like, it's really hard to just have that feeling all the time. And so I think we're also numb to that to some degree. You know, you go to a restaurant and you're like, oh, white people are being served by people of color, and you get on the bus and everywhere you go, you just see, you know, certain neighborhoods are, you know, have less services than others. It's just like everywhere, like the extreme unfairness. And I think that there's the human parts of us are exhausted by that. And it can be easier, and we're bombarded with like heartbreaking news every single minute about climate and wars, and it's just hard. I think people feel really overwhelmed. So we build barriers to feeling that pain. Also, these systems work best if we don't have very much empathy. Dehumanizing each other is essential to being in them. It's part of how we can sustain and deal with that, living under that injustice, and also tolerate our roles as people who are in hierarchies. I think being in any hierarchy requires a certain kind of numbness, right? And especially kind of targeted desensitization and hostility to people who've been told are the people who can be thrown away. And like a lot of internalized superiority that allows us to do that dehumanization and to suppress empathy. You know, this happens at the large scale, like living in a society in which men in general are trained to not have empathy for people experiencing sexual violence, and to participate in cultural rituals that tolerate or celebrate violence against women and queer people. It happens in workplace hierarchies. I heard Nathan Shera, who's a really brilliant thinker, talking about how like people who are trained to be managers and bosses and owners learn to feel comfortable lifting up their own ideas and making other people implement them, and they just think that's fine. And people who are trained to be implementers are supposed to just suppress that we have other ideas. I mean, there's just all of this kinds of numbness to each other's like lesser roles, right? Or to our own lesser roles that happen. And part of that, right, is that the systems need us to be numb to the pain that comes from being targeted. You know, there's a celebration of people having a thick skin and not complaining about injustice. And if you name experiences of exclusion or dehumanization or violence, it'll be minimized, criticized and dismissed, or you'll be called uncivil or whatever. Or you'll be told that you're bullying and harassing people by naming, you know, racism or sexism in your workplace. A couple of years ago, there was a dynamic at my school where Black law students were standing up to the law school dean about racism in the school, being like really immensely brave because it's such a hierarchical environment. It's a really big deal to do what they were doing, and the dean was describing that she was traumatized by it. You know, it's like that's just like all that kind of shit is just like all the time. You know, it's like that level of minimization of their claims, and then that reversal is just wild, right? They would be rewarded by her if they didn't, and by that system if they didn't, if they were numb to their pain and didn't talk to each other about it and didn't organize together. So what's interesting is that like after we've all been doing all this practicing at being numb to get by, and after shaping us into people with smaller emotional ranges and less access to empathy, these same systems sell us back promises of really big feelings, right? I'm doing this again, right? So on the one side, we've got numbness, desensitization, and minimization of harm. On the other side, we've got big feelings, right? So we want to feel, of course we want to feel, we're alive, we want to feel alive, but now what we get is numbness and then romantic movies, songs, and books that tell us that love is about feeling like you would die for someone and you would die without them, and you know, you'd give anything and everyone for them, and you would just want to disappear with them into oblivion, and sex is like mind-blowingly amazing, and hanging out with friends is about the party of a lifetime, and you know, being ecstatic and having glamorous photos and hilarious stories, and we watch action movies and we play video games and we like consume substances trying to feel big feelings, right? This is just like this back and forth. We want to feel, but we have a hard time feeling without the help of consumer experiences and distorted cultural fantasies. And our ability to feel is intimately bound up with the very systems that numb us. So we're happy because we're going to go to Disneyland, or someone finally gave us a diamond ring, or we win at the casino. And then numbness, anxiety, depression, isolation, boredom, and disconnection are pretty much the norm. And then we chase these various promised experiences and products to get this connection and satisfaction, like, that we just relentlessly chase. And we portray ourselves as having these big feelings on social media, and then wait obsessively for the hit of adrenaline or oxytocin that comes when somebody shares or likes our post. So it's like, in some ways, I think that the advent of social media in our lives has made this cycle of big feelings even more like kind of rapid, interesting, but it's about portraying, right? Portraying that you're living the good life, and then, so our distorted relationship, to social media and email really stem from this deep lack of connection and satisfaction. We're waiting and striving for something else to happen, for the big happy-making thing to finally be delivered in our inboxes or in our feeds. And the emergence of social media has increased the ways in which this fantasy of future satisfaction relates to ideas of being seen and praised for being individually famous. A lot of things that I think people feel compulsive about overall, like things we kind of can't stop doing and like can't stop thinking about, like when we can't stop playing a game or checking our phone or consuming a substance or obsessing over our crush, are related to both numbing out ordinary feelings and seeking big feelings. And a lot of people turn to self-help, which also makes these kind of weird outsized promises that, you'll buy this thing, maybe it's a book or like an online class, and then you'll feel better. And then we feel like shit because we didn't do it all the way, and that's why it didn't work or whatever, right? So it's like this there's a what's missing here, as I learned from my friend Dory Midnight, is subtlety, right? And I'm not saying, I think when I gave parts of the speech last night, people thought I meant it was never good to feel big things. Obviously, like, what if we could just feel the immensity that we're all here together, or like feel the immensity of love people in our lives, or feel our extreme passion for justice or appreciation for springtime or whatever. But something different about these big, these big like kind of consumer fantasy-based alternatives to boredom. So part of what this is, what I've been thinking about a lot, is how like in the movies, when magic is portrayed, or when like personal capacity for transformation is portrayed, it's pretty much always like, usually like a white male lead who's got like some kind of orientalized teacher who teaches him like a method very quickly, and then he can do something like unbelievable. So there's a picture from Doctor Strange where like this guy just shows up somewhere and just like learns this thing, and suddenly he can like open whole portals that are quite beautiful, into another place, right? And I think like The Matrix is sort of like this, and like Harry Potter is sort of, there are lots of different, like this is an idea about what transformation and personal skills look like that I think is the opposite of what they actually look like. In real life, people who seek healing and transformation are on lifelong journeys, experimenting with feeling and practicing new things, and also learning to accept that many things about us will not change, or will not change dramatically in our lives. Like the go-to automatic things I have from my experiences throughout my life, like people pleasing, or if I get angry really fast, or whatever it is, those might not go away. All that might happen is that I might know I'm having them and not have to act out every single one on other people. But I might never actually not feel those things. So there's so given this context, subtlety is really powerful, transformative, and quite rebellious. Like subtlety is the opposite of this presentation of mastery. Practicing being in reality and feeling is pretty much mostly what healing is. It yields profound experiences, but not the distorted versions of big feelings that are promised by consumer culture that wants to keep us numb, unsatisfied, striving, compulsive, empty, and disconnected from one another. I think numbness is connected to a lot of the key critiques of our time. So maybe just to keep tying this into some of the political conversations we're already in. Obviously, the conversation about numbness really ties into thinking about emotional labor, right? When people, especially like women of color feminists, are talking about the ways that women, and women of color specifically, do certain kinds of emotional labor in organizations and in social groups and in families, it's in part because some people are trained to notice how other people are doing, and some people are trained not to, right? To have practiced numbness, and like masculinity and whiteness have practiced numbness in them, right? It's also part of the conversation, obviously, about microaggressions for similar reasons, like what kinds of numbness are expected of people who are the targets of microaggressions, and what kinds of numbness is practiced by people who are engaging in microaggressions, right? How does it feel fine to me to not feel what that would sound like to you, or what that would feel like to you, right? And to not notice you. and to not have had to notice this pattern that someone else is having to live under. And also I think it has a lot to do with respectability politics. Because respectability politics in some ways are about numbing up and competing for a place at the table with like the numbest people, you know, and like getting there. And then I think the critique of respectability politics coming out of so many, transformative movements is saying like, we care about, we're not interested in having like a small elite subset of the affected group go up and join the elites above them in some way or negotiate with them. We're interested in bringing the people who are most vulnerable everywhere and always being together and not splitting and not numbing to the real, and like not negotiating away, undocumented people with, who've been charged with a violent felony or whatever it is, all the people who get made disposable inside those negotiations. So pursuing subtlety, if that's, to me, that's about like actually being interested in the unseen. And that's what all of our movements are about ultimately anyway, is exposing like the spells we're under, the lies we're under, the mythologies in the air that we're all operating as, autopilots on, and then saying like, wait, what's the real truth, right? Like, oh my God, police don't keep us safe. They're a terrifying standing army in a colonial way. Like, oh God, they're kidnapping people. You know what I mean? Like, oh, they're violent. Like that's like spell breaking, right? That's what our movements do. We break spells, we break mystifications, we see the unseen or what we've been told we're not allowed to see. And that a lot of that is practicing subtlety is a lot about that, and being able to be aware of more aspects of that and be aware more of each other's feelings and experiences and interested in them. And also potentially take more responsibility for our impact and maybe act with greater care. It means reducing our focus on striving for big feelings and rewards, like fame, fortune, the perfect body, the Hollywood-style romantic love, and being interested in the actual sensations and experiences of our lives. And I think there's a danger that might seem really boring to people compared to the extremes that we are chasing. I think that's like a legitimate concern. I've talked to a lot of people about who are like getting sober from something, and they're just like, yes, I totally want to get sober from this thing that's like fucking up my life, but I'm worried about being bored, because I've been organizing myself around this being the fun thing in life for so long. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. What have we been told is boring? I think it's also an interesting feminist question. Like, we've been told that housework and childcare and all those things are boring and unglamorous. And like, feminists have already been asking this for a long time. Like, what has been relegated to the realm of the mundane, and what has been exciting and worthwhile and compensated, right? So those are the same kinds of questions I think we can ask ourselves. We can critically ask about our gut feelings about what we're chasing. A lot of this also is about just increasing our awareness, increasing our ability to connect with others, to know what we want and what we believe. One of the things I put in this book is like an authentic no and authentic yes calculator that you can then redesign for yourself. Like, how do I know if I want to do this or not? Right? Like that. Like, it's actually really, a lot of times we don't know, right? Like, am I doing this because I want to be seen doing it? Am I doing it because I think you want me to do it? Am I doing it because I know it's terrible for me and so I'm doing it? Like, right? So like, it's, whose voices do I hear in my head when I think about how I should or shouldn't do it? What kind of person would I be if I did it or didn't do it? Like all these, like actually letting ourselves examine that process. Like, I got to a point with my distorted relationship to work at one point where I just was like, I'm not allowed to like accept more things to do unless I run them by this friend who knows I have too many things to do and can help me like get some clarity about like, why am I thinking of saying yes to this? And if I'm going to say this, I have to not do something else. And just so many of us have these patterns where we are auto yes or auto no, or in certain areas, one or the other. Maybe we're auto no to affection from a friend, and we want to wonder if there's something else there, and we could try accepting some of it under some condition that works for us, or whatever those auto moves. Like, it's freeing to be able to examine them and get somewhere else with them, and to build some awareness around what's happening under them. This is also about expanding our emotional ranges. Most of us tend to have kind of a well-worn groove of feelings. Some things are really easy to feel and some things are really hard to feel. A lot of this often relates to like childhood experiences, like were you the people pleaser in your house? Were you on tiptoes around your alcoholic parent and so you're really vigilant? Or did you get by always being ready to fight and ready to go? And so some of us feel like I can really feel appreciation, but I never feel anger, or I can't feel grief, but I often feel blank, or there's so many different, we all have a shape there, and to live more would be to be able to access more of it, is what I think, and be able to be like, am I really mad at you, or do I just always come with mad? You know what I mean? And is there another option here, or am I sure I really want to please you, or do I want to maybe like stand a little bit more for what I believe in, or all of those kinds of questions. And acceptance, right? Part of this is just also about like what I said before, like that the autos aren't necessarily going to go away. I'm going to just rush through a little bit about the romance myth. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to put something else into this from another part of the book just because it's interesting. So yeah, the romance myth, I hated it for a long time and succumbed to it extensively. I think it's a very dangerous force in our movements and in our lives. And I want to talk about what it is. First, let's just talk about some of the things the romance myth believes. The romance myth tells us that a committed romantic sexual relationship is the most important kind of relationship. There's something wrong with you if you aren't in one, and you'll never be happy. If you're in the right relationship, it'll make you happy, and sex and love will flow easily and naturally between you and your partner. Love is forever, and if it's real, if you really love each other, you'll never be attracted to anybody else, and you'll be consistently in love and sexual attraction with each other forever. Your romantic partner will meet all your emotional needs. If it's real, you'd give up anything for each other. You'd want to die if the person left you. There's one right person out there for each of us. If your love is real, you'll feel loved, whole, and complete. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you or your partner or your love. And there's a clear set of things that a romantic partner should want to do with you. And there's something wrong if they don't. There's more. The natural way of life is to find a permanent romantic partner, live together, make a lifelong commitment, and have children. And if you don't want those things, there's something wrong with you, or it's not really love. And everyone should compete for the best possible partners. And it is a competition. And best is defined by racial, economic, health, and body shape norms. And dating is a competitive market. And you should make sure you get the best possible for your long-term commitment. And you should trade up if you need to. Don't get stuck with a loser. So those are horrible things. I'm sorry we had to talk about them. But obviously, you've been immersed in them in your entire life. The romance myth does a lot of terrible things to our relationships. It makes us believe that we should be able to read each other's minds. That we should expect satisfaction is just going to appear. And we criticize our partners for not just knowing what we want, even though we haven't told them. So there's a lot of that mind reading thing is a pretty big one. How dare you, blah, 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 even though I never told you I didn't, that's not why that makes me feel that way. And I never asked myself why that gives me such a strong feeling. We assume our partner's sexual, social, and other needs will be normal, which is i.e. whatever we're expecting, based on either social norms or our own feelings. And we judge ourselves or other people if something happens that we don't believe is whatever is normal, even though people are drastically different from each other. We tend to make life plans without adequate reflection based on distortions like moving really far away for a partner, or making huge decisions because of this idea that romantic love is the most important relationship. And often people end up very isolated or become more vulnerable to abuse because of those kinds of decisions. We undermine and neglect our friendships and other supports, which can make us very isolated. We cultivate resentments against our partners, and it supports stagnated blame dynamics. So it's if you really love me, you'd want to move in with me. If you really love me, you'd want to have sex whenever I wanted to have sex. If you really love me, you'd compliment my appearance more. All these things that, again, require someone else to read our minds. We wallow in dissatisfaction based on an unattainable fantasy of romantic love. So a lot of people just are miserable because they're alone, or miserable because their partner isn't X or Y, instead of actually getting to be active in getting their needs met in whatever way they can be met, possibly beyond romantic love. We feel jealousy and possessiveness. That leads to a lot of conflict. We treat each other and view ourselves in dehumanizing ways, evaluating each other like commodities and applying harmful cultural norms. So that trading up stuff. We blame other people for our feelings, or there's some typo there. We believe that we are responsible for other people's feelings. And there's also a lot of movement level harm from this. I'm just going to be brief on this, but the romance myth has been used extensively to undermine our movement's radical disruptions and recuperate harmful systems and institutions. And so you can especially see this in the last 30 or 40 years of the sort of most well-funded gay and lesbian rights movement being applying a set of romantic symbols to recuperate institutions that have been delegitimized by social movements like the military, marriage, policing. This is just one example, right? The idea of kind of these romantic images are used to make the military into a space that we're supposed to understand as liberatory, right? The whole history of what we might call homo-nationalism or pinkwashing of U.S. and other institutions through kind of putting this gay love thing on them is an operation of the romance myth. And the romance myth also harms our movements because we act out our distorted frameworks for sex, romance, and relationships on each other in movements, and we just like destroy our organizations, and we're horrible to each other. I mean, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but in my life, I have observed that people are the worst to their romantic dates. Maybe to their blood family too, but like a lot to their dates. Like people are, I mean, I know I have acted my worst. And that should be interesting to us politically. Like, okay, wow, hot stuff. Like how should we handle that? Maybe we should really pay a lot of attention to this. Maybe we should see it as a significant threat. It's interesting that so often, for example, law enforcement infiltrators use romance, accusations of infidelity and things like that to destroy our movements. And that has been a key historical move. Like we could actually wonder about this area in our lives for a lot of reasons, including our own safety and security. So the truth about romance is that we need support from a lot of different people who some of us, who connect with us in different ways, who share different identities with us, different experiences. We can't get it all from one person ever. There's no normal way of being or relating. We have to tell people how we want to be treated, and they can say yes or no. So just a lot of people in their romantic relationships are like, but I actually did tell them, and they're like, and then they didn't want to do it. Yup, nobody has to fucking do anything for you, Like, no one person has to do everything for you, for sure, right? And if they say no, we can seek our needs elsewhere, meet them ourselves, or live without some of our needs being met, which is also something we're all doing, and we can acknowledge that about ourselves. There's no natural way to have sex. Sexual relationships require negotiation and renegotiation. They ebb and flow. There's not something wrong with your partner. There's nothing wrong with you. Like all that whole framework, which is pretty also reinforced, unfortunately, in the self-help literature. Being attracted to someone else besides your partner doesn't mean there's something wrong with your relationship. We do not have to act out all of our sexual and romantic attractions, even if they're very strong. We have choices. There's that narrative about like I was struck by Cupid's arrow and then I had to destroy the organization we all work in and like harass someone and stalk someone. Like that's romance myth shit that really supports both like just unethical behavior, but also very harmful behavior. No relationship will make you happy. We bring our long-term patterns and feelings into any relationship we enter. So the idea that you're going to find that person they're going to make you happy, that is some capitalist crap, You're probably just going to still be you and relating with another person. And so all of the stuff we bring. And then that's great. Romantic relationships stir up strong, difficult, and complex feelings, usually after an initial stage of elation. The book talks a lot about that switcheroo that happens, where you're like, oh my God, I love you so much. Oh my God, stop chewing like that. Romantic relationships can be a place to learn about ourselves and grow, but they're not more necessary or more important than other relationships. I'm a very strong advocate for friendship. I think friendship tends to be the place where people give and receive the most honest feedback and have a lot of transformative experiences. Not that can't happen in romantic relationships, but I think friendship is one of the more neglected relationships that's pretty radical in heteropatriarchy and capitalism. Neither staying in relationships nor breaking up is better or worse. And that's really hard. That's not often supported in the self-help literature. Good feelings that seem to stem from the new relationship do not come from the other person. They're our own capacities for connection, joy, satisfaction, pleasure, creativity, relaxation, and excitement. Right? So that person who's just making you feel so amazing, you're just feeling so amazing. Right? Or like total shit too, right? Like that's probably also not their fault. Committed relationships, polyamorous relationships, monogamous relationships, anonymous sex, brief relationships, open relationships are all politically and morally equal. That's hard, right? Because we like to go all ways with this, but everybody's like, no, this is the radical one. That has not helped our communities be able to have consent and make choices and have authenticity. Most of what is going on inside each of us about our romantic partnerships is a projection and has little to do with the other person. Sometimes I think the person we know the least about is that person, or those people. It's like a real projection show. Relationships change and feelings change. You don't get to keep anything. Efforts to own or control other people or to control other people's feelings are futile and painful. Relationships based on compromising ourselves and our destinies, and our desires are stifling and full of resentment. At their best, our relationships should support our full development and cultivate our desires rather than treating them as threats. So it's really important for when we feel like we have to try to control and contain somebody else and not have them want what they want, or when we feel like we have to accept not wanting what we want to be relating. Those are illusions that are not, they don't support healing. I swear to God, this is almost over. The idea that there is a scarcity of partners or only one right person is harmful. I mean, really, truly, truly harmful and deeply sexist. Many of the needs we are encouraged to meet through romantic and sexual connections, like sexual gratification, physical affection, affirmation about our appearance, play, intellectual stimulation, feeling seen, companionship, sharing our stories, sharing holidays, sharing meals, cohabitation, can be met through friendships, family, and or through our relationships with ourselves. And when we know that, we enter into relationships with a lot greater ability to relate than when we think we have to get these things from a date. So other parts of this book that exist, just to give you a sense of it, a big part of this book is just about why we're so mean to each other, and like what to do when you're feeling like you want to despise or take down somebody else, how to support people who are being taken down, targeted on the internet or otherwise in your community, how to support ourselves when we're experiencing that, and how to just how to deal with the really strong feelings that of course come up when we work on our most passionate questions with other people. Like, it's not surprising. Like, if you do work that matters to you, you will experience conflict, and that's not a bad thing. And so and the worst thing is when it means I have to get rid of you and take down this organization or whatever the case may be. A lot of the book is about kind of pro-sex realism, about how we act terrible around sex and love. So not trying to be like sex and love are bad or we're terrible, but just we act terrible. And figuring out how to develop ourselves in relationships of all kinds. A bunch of the book is about distortions about work, procrastination, burnout, overwork, technology addiction, conditioned tendencies of hierarchy and control that most of us play out in projects that are highly formal or very informal, in our artwork and our activist work, all of it. And there's a lot of looking at the tools that exist out there, a lot of which there's things that are to be despised about all of them, and then what I tried to do with it. How even though 12-step is crammed down people's throats in the carceral system and is really problematic in a lot of ways, also it's an amazing, very horizontal, unprofessional, free of charge model. And so how to find what's interesting in these things and see whether any of it's useful or not. And then finally there's quizzes, charts, and worksheets and diagrams, because I like those magazine things from when I was younger. And I'm trying to make something that people could skim and use together and not have to feel overwhelmed by text all the time. I think that's it. Yeah, so that's an introduction to my new project. And during the Q&A, it's fine if you want to talk about something else, from other parts of my work that you're reading in class or whatever. We don't have to focus on the stuff I presented today.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. So if you would like to ask questions, there are microphones at the end of each aisle. You can come down, and I can also bring the microphone.
Greatest reward ever.
Any questions? Any comments? Anyone? I can bring the microphone to you. Okay.
Thanks. When you showed the picture of the two people kissing and talking about the military and stuff, you used a word homonationalism, and I have no idea what that means. Can you please talk a little bit about that?
Totally. Yes. I use that word, and I also use the word pinkwashing. One resource for looking at more things about that word is Jasbir Puar's book, Terrorist Assemblages. Another person who writes about that word is Jin Haridawarn, which is, I can't spell that long word out loud, I'm sorry. There's a lot of great people writing about that word. What I'm trying to talk about there, to give you the quick and dirty, is the ways in which a certain strain of gay and lesbian rights politics, the one that became the one that's most visible now, came to really be aligned with the main nationalist projects, so that it becomes it goes from being a movement that had a lot of different claims, including a lot of the movement in the 1960s and 70s had a lot of people who were participating in other movements that were against police violence and were pushing back against social control and part of a broader global concern about racism and colonialism. And instead, and this in the 80s and 90s, this sort of white gay and lesbian rights movement emerges that's interested in military service, hate crimes laws, which increase police and prosecutorial power, and marriage, right? So it takes these three institutions that were all targets of left movements that expose them as arenas of social control and maldistribution and state violence, and instead says, hey, let us be part of them. And in those ways, it actually becomes a site of recuperating those systems, like portraying those systems as places to get liberated by being included. So it's like real mindfuck turnaround. And people also use this word pinkwashing to talk about that, talk about like we're going to take the military and wrap a big rainbow flag around it and be like, but it's gay friendly. And this most famously has been done by the state of Israel in a kind of explicit PR campaign to say our military lets LGBT people serve. So we're a wonderful progressive country, just ignore our colonization of Palestine, like that. And that move is made also by many in the US very extensively. So yeah, I think those words, homonationalism and pinkwashing, both are kind of about that. Although I don't think you have to use those words to talk about that. It's just a way of us being able to notice that sometimes when reforms happen in our name, they're not in our interest. And the only people who benefit from them would be mostly people who aren't queers at all, the institutions themselves, and then also maybe a small elite of queers who can get something out of that. Yeah, that get at it? Okay, good question. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was both intellectually stimulating and hilarious. There's a lot of lines in there that I'm going to remember for a long time. So I was really intrigued also about how you made connections between romantic relationships and work and movement building. And I'm wondering if in your project you theorize or talk about two concepts that I'm interested in. One is compromise and one is longevity. And compromise because this is often saluted as something good for movement building. And longevity because it seems like, and I don't mean to push back, but just I'm curious about this, that if I followed some of what you said, our interactions or our movements might be very brief. And I wonder if longevity is something to strive for or not.
Great. Those are wonderful questions. I love it. I love that you asked about compromise because one of my favorite self-help books about romance that has the worst title, which I'm only going to say once, and then we're going to pretend we didn't have to listen to it. It's called Passionate Marriage. I should have when did you get your vomit bag out? One of the things that this brilliant, very interesting author says in it is that in our romantic relationships, we shouldn't compromise. And I remember being bowled over by that the first time I read that, maybe 15 years ago. Because the whole framework is about compromise, right? People are, we're told you must compromise. And so the idea that the agreement we should be making is for me to be my full self and you to be your full self is so different than the agreement that I'm automatically getting into this to give up my hopes and dreams, which I think really relates to the family formation norm of this country, which is everyone should have to move away from their families to go to shitty jobs, and women should have to give up their work desires and all of this, and men should have to give up their desires to get to have connected parenting so they can work a zillion hours, all these, agreements that are kind of the typical. So I think that's interesting to think about, if we push back on the idea of compromise as the norm, and if we're part of very militant movements that are trying to say we're not going to compromise parts of our population away from liberation. We're not going to compromise with systems of domination to say let's just give some immigration relief to just the good people, or just let's give some I think that's it's interesting to pair those. So I really appreciate you raising that. In terms of longevity, what I really wanted to talk about was the romance myth's idea about longevity, that it values longevity. But I think probably my whole hope here is that we're building movements that are very strong and durable. But I am interested in that. A lot of my other work is about social movement infrastructure and why we want to make movements we want to be loyal to movements and principles, not to organizations. So we want to be able to also let our organizations dissolve when they're not working, and we don't want to be able to let our romantic relationships change when they're not working. We don't want to be building loyalty to rigid forms that often are about our egos and certain kinds of leadership or statuses. Instead, we want to keep making things that work practically, and that means that movements change all the time. And so the longevity isn't about like, we've got the longest running nonprofit that's got the best grants and we're better than the other people who do the same stuff in this town. It's about the longevity of like, you've been working on certain issues for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, and you know a lot of people are working on them too, and your relationships change over time. And for a while, you really had a hard time with that person, and now you're like, oh my God, that person's my only ally on this important topic. And you just kind of look around and you're like, I'm just assuming I'm going to see you all again, and that we're just going to have to keep each other. Like, I wish someone had told me when I was 21 in social movements that everybody I was around then, I would still be around now. I mean, the people who lived, and I would, and that I think I would have treated people differently. You know what I mean? And including all the people we were all screwing. Like, I think, handling each other with care, even while we have light contact. Like, it's not about having to get married about it, but like figuring out that level of humanization of each other. So I think that's a question like longevity of what, and then sort of what are we been told has this, there are people, theorists who talk about like kind of the timeline of the nation is the idea of forever. The United States will always exist is what the United States wants to believe, because actually it's like this fragile settler colonial project that's very recent. And all of its technologies of control are fragile and recent and soon to end, I'm sure. And so how do we, and then the story of marriage ties us emotionally to the timeline of the nation state, that we are supposed to be in these forever frameworks. And it's just a bunch of lies, because like the brutal reality of the actual world is that we're all constantly changing and dying and being born, and and that our relationships change and our needs change, and it's uncomfortable, and it involves a whole range of emotions instead of like a happily ever after. So there's like so many things to cut through around like that false longevity in order to like have a conversation about what kinds of longevity we think are provocative and productive for the disruptions we're seeking and the like alternative social relations we're building. And I love the way you put it. Those are things I had not thought about before. Thank you.
Hi. So first, I just want to thank you for being here at Smith, and also Miss Major, and for all of the work that you both do. And thank you, Professor DeClue, for putting this together. So my question has to do with Trans Day of Visibility, and I'm just wondering, what you think about this notion that visibility or some sort of trans tipping point is going to somehow create societal acceptance for trans people. What is the harm, both individually for trans people, physically, mentally, spiritually, but how does this also harm our political movements and our political organizing? And then just generally, like, is there any possibility for healing through a politics of visibility, or is it necessarily always harmful and erasing?
Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah, please, Major, do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that question about visibility. These motherfuckers haven't said we were visible for over 45 fucking years. Now all of a sudden we're visible. Oh, that's right, because Laverne Cox is on Time Magazine. Mm-hmm. Well, if that's the case, I've been on Time Magazine, so what, does that mean I don't exist? And so they're going to make us visible now. The people that aren't visible are trans men. All of a sudden, they're now acknowledging, oh, there's another side to that damn coin. Well, coins have always had two sides, And so this day of visibility is not a day of any acknowledgement to who we are as people, or that we have a right to exist, or that they're concerned about our existence and that we're here. And we're here. And we're not going no fucking place. And thank you for you.
Thank you, Major. That's all so true. I think that this moment of mainstreaming is something I've been thinking a lot about. Like when things go mainstream, one way I've been thinking about this is like something I saw about how, like, what did white people in the United States think about racism in the 1940s or 50s? Right, like, admitting they're racist, believing that racism is right, and then when you ask them, today, white people would be like, oh, we're all not racist, but the conditions for people of color have worsened. Right, like we've grown this giant prison system, we've grown this militarized border system, like the racial wealth divide, all of it, right? So, wow, like that would be a moment of mainstreaming or increasing visibility where the United States reorients its relationship to white supremacy to one of denial, including individual people personally believe that they can't possibly be playing a role. What's happening then, right? And so I think that's the danger of visibility is that you get, or of mainstreaming in general, is that you get new iterations that reaffirm old stories about deservingness. So like there's a few trans people who are acceptable, Caitlyn Jenner, whatever, right? That are, if they follow the rules of white femininity or whatever, all the things. And most people's lives are the same shitty situation or worse. At the same time, there is something so powerful about us seeing each other, right? Like, that's why it's so powerful to see Major's movie. It's like a movie we've never gotten to see before. It is really meaningful for us to see each other. And I think a lot of us who have marginalized identities and work in places where we're the only one or something like that, we feel that. We're like, oh God, I think I saw someone else. Like, it matters that we're accompanied. And so I think that's the question. It's like, whose visibility project, and is it to be visible to who? Like, it's that dynamic of like, is a pride parade a protest? It's, it certainly doesn't feel that way at this time. It's like for straight people to go and like gawk and feel good about themselves or something. You know what I mean? And what does it mean for us to claim those spaces or to claim those moments as moments of disruption? And I just went to, I was in San Diego and I was talking to these students who are young trans people who are part of organizing some kind of like first time trans march or something in San Diego. And there's a debate about whether or not to include the cops. And there's a trans police officer in San Diego. So the people who are in the group, mostly who are parents of trans people, are all like, but there's a trans police officer, we should definitely include the police. And then the trans people in the group are like, fuck no. And it's just like, that's what we're living. It's like they declare victory by passing us these like crappy crumbs of representation. And so we have to be very vigilant now, about this, because this is exactly how it works. And it's like our time to be like put through this mill in this particular way. It's really hard. But I still think seeing each other in our fullness, not through these like limited scopes, is deeply vital to our survival.
Anyone else have a question, comment? Okay.
I love the new project. It's amazing.
Thank you.
My question is, some students and I are reading your book now and also talking about transformative justice. And we're struggling with the kind of don't exile, don't shame, and also the relationship to revolutionary violence. And like Fanon's claim that the only way to decolonize is through violence. So I guess I'm just wondering if you could talk about the relationship between those things and is there a reconciling of them or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is. I mean, for me, I'm really glad you brought that up, because another danger of this project would be that I'd be like, let's be nice to everyone and see the humanity of the police officers and hand them flowers, and we can't ever, like that. A big danger is that because we live in a context of this pacifist mythology that's very dominant in the wake of the revolutionary movements in the 60s and 70s, where we criminalize people who are part of resistant groups that have taken up armed self-defense and whatnot, and then we're like, we promise our protest was peaceful, like that, and it was actually planned by the school board, like a kind of level of refusing a diversity of tactics and criminalizing each other when we take on, like you push over a mailbox at a protest and now I'm like reporting you to the cops. Like this is a horrible ethic we're involved in that makes it so important that you all are studying those questions about what it means when people do take up arms and engage in both armed self-defense and violence to, get rid of systems that are not going to go away because we ask them to nicely, right? And that are absolutely not doing that. And so I think, to me, I was actually just reading Peter Gelderloos's book, How Nonviolence Protects the State, which is just like a book I go back to and teach again and again. I really like. And there's a part of it at the end that I'd never noticed before, where he was talking about how like he's talking about like his vision for the world, and he's talking about how he doesn't think that we're going to get rid of current systems without some people using some of those tactics, and like that we need to be acknowledged that will be part of these struggles, even though that's not the only thing that happens in these struggles. And he says that what really matters is how you treat your enemies after their defeat. And I thought it was so interesting, right? Because that is a really interesting like ethical question, right? Like because I believe, obviously, that we should draw people into our movements by making them magnetic and open and connective and non-judgmental towards newbies and letting people make mistakes and all that stuff. And I also believe that we're going to only win through pressure. It's not like all the like cops and all the deans and all the bankers are going to be like, those people are right. Poverty is bad. I think I'll stop having everything. Like that's not going to happen. And so, how do we acknowledge that there will be, and there always has been, pressure and there already is extreme violence. So of course there will continue to be violence, and there might be new kinds of violence that might be better than some of the existing kinds of violence. And so I think Gelderloos's point, there's something about what are the ethics of how we do this. And that also comes down into like paranoia in our movements or kicking people out in violent ways, like how do we acknowledge that we might take up lots of tactics and then not use it to devour each other? Because you also hear those stories about 60s and 70s movements that engaged in more armed self-defense or blew things up or whatever. It's like, so I think that there's like, it's like so hard to have that conversation because of the taboo around talking honestly about diversity of tactics, and then also because the taboo about talking honestly about how we treat each other and how we use kind of everything we pick up to harm each other first before the system. So if we're gonna pick some stuff up, we need to like have some skills for looking at some of our automatic behaviors, I think. But I don't know the answers, but I do think that it's worthwhile to read that last chapter in Gilderless again. I read it really differently this time, which was interesting. Yeah, it's kind of an older book, yeah.
So we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Anyone has some thoughts, some comments? Sure. Pass the microphone to Izzy.
So I'm in Professor Dillon's class, and we just started reading your book this week. And one thing that's really struck with me so far is your emphasis on the impossibility, and that's something that I see here again today, you know, taking this really deeply problematic genre of self-help and transforming it into something that can actually be useful for radicals. And so I'm just wondering, you know, what is your draw to this idea of impossibility, and how do you even go about like imagining futurity with impossibility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I just, you know, I feel the haunt of Margaret Thatcher all the time. You know, there's no alternative. I mean, she's dead, thank God. And I feel it. You know, my students are just like, their first reaction to most things I teach is like, that's impossible. No, absolutely not. It can't happen. You know what I mean? We just are really stuck in that. So I think that's part of the reason it's been such a central question, and because I'm trying to recover from any idea of perfectionism or having to know. Like, one of the things I'm always trying to deal with is like, I don't have to know how this is going to turn out. I'm just going to trust this group I'm in, and we're just going to try this thing. Or I don't know how this is going to turn out. I'm going to take this emotional risk in this relationship with my friend, or I'm going to get out of something that seems bad to me even though I don't know what's coming next. Or, you know, like all of it, like just there's a level of like practicing some kind of like surrender, some kind of willingness to not know. And then that we like, because we live in a world that's so unlike the world we want, and we only have the clues of each other's kind of best ideas and moments of inspiration and historical groups that have said helpful things. We just have these hints about what we're even going for. We're kind of like practicing while we go. That idea of impossibility is like freeing to me somehow. I'm like, oh yeah, sure, we're impossible while we're actually doing it. You know, like I feel like that's just the charge we live with, and that thing lives inside us. We get to a place, a lot of us who are good at saying, like, I think I'm good at being like, yeah, we can do it. Nothing's impossible about something, you know, prison abolition or whatever, like this is my writing. I still have places I get to personally where I'm just like, I just can't do that. I just can't feel that. You know what I mean? Like, because it's just like, and so it's so helpful to have an ethic surrounding all of us that acknowledges that feeling that things cannot happen or there's no alternative to this way of being is a spell we're under. And we can remind each other about it. And it can be about imagining the big things like, what if every single person had single thing they need? I think that's actually possible. And I don't know exactly what it'll look, but I'm sure it can happen, you know? And nobody has to be in a cage, and like nobody has to be hurt, like, you know, in these ways that are just the common ways right now. And I might need help taking some risk and having some friend remind me that that's what I believe when I, for example, I mean, the amount that I've needed support from friends to be willing to present this work publicly, or, you know, I mean, who I didn't even show it to. I was told I was doing it. Some of whom are in the room have been very kind about being like, yeah, it's totally fine for you to do that, Dean. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna be exposed as like a hippie and, you know, woo woo and, you know, whatever. And everyone's gonna be like, that's so neoliberal and, you know, whatever. All of which is probably true. But yeah, so I think that for me it's happening on like a lot of different levels. And that idea, I think for me also just it really started for me with just being like, doing legal services for trans people and just having the systems that people are living in just be like, you can't exist. You can't possibly, you cannot exist. You can't be in our computer system and have these markers. We can't put you anywhere. You can't be a person who needs shelter. You know, like that we are impossible, and they can say that all day long, and it's just, here we are. And that feels that feels liberatory to me, and it feels like a mutual practice. I could definitely not do it by myself. It's like all of these things only happen because we're practicing them together and like just taking the next guess and like trying the next thing.
Okay, we have time for one more. All right.
Hi, I really liked your lecture. It was really incredible. I was also just thinking, like, you kind of just touched on it, like taking these kinds of ideas and dealing with the law, because you're dealing with like the law being this like really, like you mentioned, like this isolating and like categorical like structure. How do you kind of take these ideas and apply them there and trying to rework or reframe it?
I don't have a lot of, I'm not interested in making the law better, I'll be honest with you. I think it's pretty much, our job, I think, in terms of dealing with legal systems is to support people who are in them right now and try to dismantle their role in our lives, you know? So a lot of my thinking is about, and the things I try to practice with other people is just about like how to shield people from law enforcement and how to advocate for people who are kind of in the crux of that, and then also how to imagine a world in which we don't run through coercive systems, which is what law and law enforcement are. So like how to imagine a world in which the way we decide to be together comes from us and comes from below. So thinking about concepts like mutual aid and self-organization, autonomy, like those lots of different words are used by lots of different kinds of like activists and thinkers, but imagining that like we could best come up with how to deal with the problems amongst us and how to distribute the resources amongst us, and you know, like that instead of having it come from like bosses, cops, corporations, et cetera. So yeah, so I think often because I'm a lawyer and a lot of professor, people think that maybe I think that we should do something with the law that would fix it. But I think we live under like a colonial white supremacist legal system, and so it'll keep producing the same results. And our job is to dismantle it and support people in it, and like those things really go together. And it is interesting to think of law in other ways. Like that word is interesting because there's like the laws of nature or like scientific, like law can, it's an abstract, it can be an abstract concept for thinking generally about rule systems. And I think that a lot of the communities I'm in have more of a value for like guidance or guidelines or agreements, things that can be renegotiated, things that are contextual and local and get to be reinvented by us, which is different than, because a lot of times my students think that what we're trying to do is imagine like a different legal system, or like maybe international law will come in and save us from domestic law, you know, those kinds of things. And I think that that general whole model of a hierarchical system with a set of abstract principles that are supposed to be universal inevitably will support like the role of like the nation state form and these kind of abstract universal categories that inevitably are like leaving people out and ignoring the realities of people's lives. So yeah, I'm looking for something less law-ish and more bottom-up-ish. Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much. That you join us tomorrow here at 1 o'clock for the screening of Major and Major's talk, and then our panel discussion afterwards. So enjoy your evening, and I hope to see you tomorrow.